Good afternoon, and welcome to our program to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and women's constitutional right to vote. I'm Lorraine Maffa, Programming Coordinator at Loudoun County Public Library and the program's host. We have some terrific speakers today, but before we get started, I want to make sure you're able to send questions and comments during the program. Please move your cursor to the bottom of your screen until you see a set of icons appear. Click on the one for participants and the one for chat. You should now see the chat box, which will enable you to type comments and questions. If you direct them to the host or to all panelists, I'll be able to relay the questions to our speakers after their talk. If you prefer to ask the question yourself, click on the raise hand box that's a small square located on top of the chat line over to the right. I'll see that your hand is raised and can unmute you to ask you questions. And now I'm happy to hand the program over to Tracy Gillespie, Historic Site Manager for Nova Parks and Chair of the Loudoun Heritage Consortium. Welcome, Tracy.
All right, I'm on. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lorraine, and welcome to everyone who's joining us for our program today, commemorating the centennial of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote in the United States. As Lorraine said, I'm Tracy Gillespie. I'm a member of the Loudoun Heritage Consortium and also Historic Site Manager with Nova Parks. Our 30 parks present the best of Northern Virginia through nature, history, and great family experiences. Today, I'm wearing the history hat. I'm joined today by several women who are going to be sharing some of the story that led to that crucial turning point in our history, the culmination of over 70 years of efforts to gain women's right to vote. Starting in 1848 and continuing until 1920, individual women, as well as state and national organizations, fought vigorously for women's suffrage. Today, we'll get a bit of a background on women's suffrage in general, focus some on the Commonwealth of Virginia and also here in Loudoun County, and we'll hear about the League of Women Voters as well. It's my honor today to be joined by a couple of my fellow members of the Loudoun Heritage Consortium. We have with us Jackie Lee, who is the Museum Engagement Manager with Morven Park in Leesburg. We also have Laura Christensen. Laura is the Curator of Manuscripts and Archives at Thomas Balch Library in Leesburg. And we have Joanne McAlpin, who is the Social Media Coordinator with the League of Women Voters. Before I turn things over to them, though, I'd like everyone watching to take a deep breath, close your eyes, go back in time with me to August of 1921, and we are going to meet suffragist Mrs. Robert Mimi Walker, who will share with us her story of how hard she worked to ensure the passage of the 19th Amendment. Mimi, are you with us?
Yes.
We'd love to hear from you, Mimi.
Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? I'm so happy to be meeting with you this afternoon and so delighted that you're interested in hearing my story about being a suffragist. It is an amazing story. It was amazing times. So please pay attention. I have two epiphany stories to tell you about: marches, parades, and my hope for the future of this great land with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Let me first begin by telling you about the word suffragist. It came about from Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who met in a London police station, having just been jailed for participating in suffragette activities in England. Those activities sadly included vandalism and setting buildings on fire and throwing rocks through windows. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns decided when they came back to the United States, they would not engage in such behaviors, that they would be far more ladylike. So they coined the term suffragist. I would also like to tell you about my attire today. because again, it was part of how we presented as suffragists. My sash is yellow, white, and gold. The yellow stands for the light of God that is in all of us, and also the state flower of Kansas, where women once had the right to vote and sadly lost it. The white stands for purity, and our temperance sisters who are fighting to make sure that temperance in this country took place and alcohol was completely diminished. The purple stands for majesty and loyalty, because we were loyal to one another and yet still loyal to this country. But we did not have equal rights as with men. I was raised in New Oxford, Pennsylvania, the second of 6 children in a Quaker family. My parents taught us that all it takes for evil to take over the world is for a few good people to do nothing. And my father made it so clear that when you educate a woman, you educate a family. My mother had the wonderful opportunity when she was a young woman to shake hands with Abraham Lincoln as his train came through New Oxford, Pennsylvania. She was but a young girl, but that moment gave her her epiphany moment to make sure that patriotism was alive and well in our family. Because of my father's belief in an education for all women, I had the opportunity to go to Swarthmore College. And there I met my husband, Robert. Both of us firmly believed in the path that had already been created for suffragists by Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and certainly Frederick Douglass, who taught all of us that wanted to make a difference in this great land to agitate, agitate, agitate. And he also taught us about the power of a picture. After Robert and I were married, when we graduated, we moved to Baltimore. We moved into a lovely estate with his family. I was therefore considered one of the uppity ladies at that time, because most of us and many of us as early suffragists had the time and the wherewithal to be able to fight for the right to vote for women. Robert supported me wonderfully. And in that capacity, and having moved to Baltimore, he became an importer of European goods. My first epiphany happened when I went down to his office one day, and I met a young woman named Rebecca. She was 26 years old. She had 2 children with her. They shared her curly red hair. I was quite taken with them, and she was very, very pregnant, her 7th child at age 26. She had come down to the wharf to see her husband for a few minutes so he would give her grocery money for the evening meal. Well, with that information, I realized this young new mama was going to need a dinner. So my cook and I got together and we planned a delicious, healthy dinner, which I planned to take down to the wharf and deliver to Rebecca and her husband, George. It was a cold, wet, damp night. That night, I chose to go down to the wharf and visit George and Rebecca. I heard some things and smelled some things I'd never quite heard before. I heard lots of yelling behind many doors, and people that were inebriated and saying awful things. I thought for sure by the time I got to George and Rebecca's that I would be welcomed into a peaceful household and I would be able to hold a newborn baby. Sadly, though, when I got to their door, I heard Rebecca shout, "Stop it, stop it, stop it." And I heard George bellow at her, "You're a no good harlot. You're a no good harlot." Then I heard a loud thunk, which must have been her and her head banging against a wall, and I heard silence. Only the whimpering of little children. It was not the image I had planned for. And I also was too cowardly to knock on the door and go in and try to offer some assistance, so I left. But in that long walk home back to my well-lit estate that was peaceful and quiet, I made a vow that I would do everything in my power to help such women as Rebecca who did not have the right to vote. Because you see, at that time, in 1915, there were only 12 states west of the Mississippi where women could vote. Yet there were 12 countries around the world where women could vote. Ireland, Scotland, Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, even Russia. But here in the United States, 20 million women did not have the same equality as men. It was not long after that incident with Rebecca that I ran back into my Swarthmore classmate, Alice Paul, and her friend, Lucy Burns. They told me of all the work that they'd been doing, trying to educate women about the right to vote. They were making pamphlets, having meetings. They organized the National Women's Party. Of course, I got involved, and I even had the opportunity to become the president of the National Women's Party in Baltimore. And so, as part of all of this energy, when, after Teddy Roosevelt, who so wanted us to have the right to vote, 2 administrations he served, and we still weren't able to get to that place. Finally, Woodrow Wilson, when he was elected in 1912, and his inauguration was to happen in 1913, Lucy and Alice decided that we as suffragists should be part of that event. So they went to Wilson's inauguration committee and said, we should be able to march. They were told, no, you can't march with us because you're women. Well, that really made them even that much more indignant, and all of us who heard that as indignant as well. So what we decided to do, really at the idea of Lucy and Alice, was to have a parade the day before the inauguration right down Pennsylvania Avenue, so that when Woodrow Wilson got off his train at Union Station, no one was there to greet them. He found an empty station. 100,000 people, though, were lining the streets of Pennsylvania Avenue, hearing about this grand parade of the suffragists. There were 8,000 of us, a beautiful woman with long brunette hair on a white horse, carrying a banner that said, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Behind her were 8,000 women and some men. My Robert walked and marched with me, all representing people that wanted equality in this great land. It ended up being a crowd of spectators that were not quite that polite. Many of them were inebriated, jeered at us, spit at us, threw rotten food, if they could, at us. One of my suffragist sisters, Helen Keller, was so shook up that that evening she had to be taken to the hospital. Well, just to make sure that Congress also understood, along with President Wilson, the importance of women to get the right to vote, on the 7th of April, the following month, the first day of Congress, another parade was held. This time, 10,000 women showed up from all over the country. And this time, the Delta Sigma Theta girls were able to join us. They had asked for the first parade to be able to participate. Alice asked they march at the end of the parade. Not this time. They intermingled. And people like Ida Mae Wells, Jennings, and so many other African Americans made their presence known. Mary Church Terrell. And we were so grateful to have that representation, because that really was a part of America, all of us as women. Well, after that parade, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns continued to encourage us to have our meetings, educate the public, meet wherever we could, offer lectures. And then Woodrow Wilson encountered being elected for a second term. He had done nothing for us during his first term. But in that year, 1916, when he was elected and then inaugurated again in 1917, one of our women, that beautiful Inez Mulholland, became sick with pernicious anemia and died in California. That gave us the right and the power to continue on. Not long after that, we decided in January to picket daily. I did. I stood in front of the White House numerous times. I was arrested on the 14th of July, Bastille Day, taken to the Lorton Reformatory and treated horribly. I had my second epiphany moment there. When we got there, we were treated terribly by Superintendent Whitaker, who said, "You ain't no suffragist. My mama ain't no suffragist. We're going to teach you a lesson here." Our clothes were taken from us, our jewelry, our glasses, our shoes. We were thrown into jail cells, given a blanket that reeked of urine and vomit. It was terrible. Our food was muddy water, soup with worms in it. With that kind of treatment, we staged hunger strikes. Those hunger strikes were met by forced feeding. This was Wilson's idea. A tube was stuck down our throats with a mixture of flour and egg, hoping none of us would turn into a martyr to inspire other suffragists. That kind of treatment went on for the rest of the year, and the worst part of it was what my second epiphany was. And then after I tell you that story, I'll tell you what my hope is for the future. My second epiphany happened when the administration told the Negro girls to go ahead and beat up on us suffragists. And a little woman named Sally, whose eyes had met mine one time in the dining hall, cornered me in a hallway and put a fist to my face. I knew she was doing what she only needed to do. We both, I know, made a commitment to go back out in the street and continue to fight for the rights for women. No women needed to be treated like animals like that. And while we were there, another Negro girl had a baby boy. And when that baby boy first cried, we all decided we would continue our fight. Time went on. And within a few years, finally, Wilson got the idea that it was time for us to vote. He took it to Congress. Neither chamber could find full voting to ratify the amendment, so he turned it over to the states. And on August 18th, 1920, a young congressman from Tennessee, a man named Harry Byrne, was thought to vote for the 19th Amendment. Not against the 19th Amendment, excuse me. He had gotten a letter the night before from his mother, and she had said, now, Harry, you do the right thing. You make sure that you vote. And with Harry's vote, the 36th state ended up being a vote for the 19th Amendment, and the 19th Amendment was then fully made into law on the 26th of August. Well, I am not going to tell you who I voted for in that election of 1920, Warren Harding or James Cox. It was not our way as suffragists to be able to tell people how to vote. But we were able to go out and continue to educate women and help them see that now they had a voice in their own land, and that the democracy we had been fighting for in World War I in Europe was not hypocritical. It would now also include us. So my final thoughts for you as I leave you today include this, that maybe someday there will be a memorial to honor all of these suffragists and the turning point in American history. My hope is that someday there may be a woman on the Supreme Court and maybe women on the Supreme Court, that maybe there'll be a female Secretary of State, maybe a female House of Representatives Speaker. Maybe someday we'll all be able to look at 116th Congress in the year 2020 and see over 120 women represented. That is my hope. And my final hope for all of us is that never, ever again will our daughters, our sisters, our mothers, our aunts, our grandmothers have to stand in front of the White House and say, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Thank you. And now you will hear the words of that great piece of American legislation, the 19th Amendment.
The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
Good afternoon. My name is Jackie Lee. I am the Museum Engagement Manager at Morven Park in Leesburg, and I'm here to offer a road trip, so to speak, through the women's suffrage movement, which began in 1848 and led to the 19th Amendment's ratification in August of 1920. We'll look at some of the key players, events, and challenges that led to the amendment's ratification. Meet Elizabeth Cady Stanton. mother, activist, and resident of this home in Seneca Falls, New York. She struggled to accept the traditional domestic role of women in American society. She wondered why women were considered less than citizens in their own nation. After meeting with local sympathizers, Stanton and others quickly organized the first women's convention of 300 people in July 19th and 20th, 1848. They all gathered at the Wesleyan Chapel, one of only a few gathering places that allowed female speakers in its day. It was here where Stanton delivered her Declaration of Sentiments, modeled after the Declaration of Independence. In it, she included a radical demand for suffrage. I got to visit Seneca Falls recently. You can see on the banner that Frederick Douglass was a participant, as was Lucretia Mott and Mary Ann McClintock. The abolitionist movement was closely aligned with the women's rights movement for a time. During the Civil War, women were asked to set aside their specific cause and rally to support voting rights for all people, thinking this would include them. Unfortunately, societal pushes led to them being asked to support the 15th Amendment, giving the vote to African American men only. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan Brownell Anthony met and eventually formed the National Woman Suffrage Association in 1869, separate from the American Woman Suffrage Association that did support the new law enfranchising Black men. Anthony went on to unite the suffrage movement in the 1880s with the formation of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. Carrie Chapman Catt held office in NAWSA from 1900 to 1904, and she returned as president from 1915 to 1920. Catt's winning plan for coordinated state-by-state suffrage laws proved successful in spite of her younger, more aggressive counterparts, and she went on to establish the League of Women Voters. Now, Wyoming became the first state government to grant women the vote in 1890, followed by Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. You can see on this map that full suffrage was not the norm. Partly a ploy to attract more women to move west, it did still benefit the suffrage movement as women began casting ballots and other women got involved in their own state's quest for suffrage. Smear campaigns, though, projected men's fears that family relations would crumble and that women would become drinking, absent vices to society if they gained the right to vote. Wealthy white women in power, like Mrs. Grover Cleveland, didn't see the point of voting. They united with business interests and racial segregationists who preferred the status quo to prevent suffrage from taking hold. Alice Paul had trained in Great Britain with the Suffragettes. Back in the U.S., she joined forces with Anna Howard Shaw and NAWSA and chaired the Congressional Committee, giving her a role to manage a national parade for women's suffrage in D.C. on March 3, 1913, the day before Wilson's inauguration. Volunteers helped recruit marchers, donations, press attention, and floats for the march. In order to appeal to the press, they found women like Inez Milholland, nicknamed the most beautiful suffragist, to lead the parade on horseback. The float included a banner which read, "We demand an amendment to the Constitution of the United States, enfranchising the women of this country." Women lined up to process with their state or professional affiliations on March 3rd. Notice the massive crowds who steadily closed in on the marchers, forcing them into a nearly single-file line. Facing insults and violence, they finished the parade and then took their experience to the press, using it as a marketing tool to express outrage and disgrace at Washington's inability to protect them. The suffrage cause won a lot of sympathy that day. African American women could be members of the National Association, but state and local organizations could still prohibit their involvement. This led to tensions at the parade, as women like Ida B. Wells Barnett, who had founded the National Association of Colored Women, as well as the Alpha Suffrage Club of Chicago, they wanted to march with their Illinois delegation, but were prohibited. But don't worry, she did it anyways. Mary Church Terrell, organizer with the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, marched with women from Howard University and the Delta Sigma Theta sorority. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns separated from NASA and co-founded the more radical National Woman's Party in 1916, leading a strategy pushing for a federal amendment. President Wilson had tried to keep the U.S. out of the Great War in Europe, but by spring of 1917, he felt that we needed to get involved to help preserve democracy abroad. Many women in the suffrage movement felt that the U.S. was willing to fight for other countries' democracy. We should at least acknowledge the hypocrisy that women at home, who were also contributing to the war effort, were prevented from the democratic right to vote. On January 10th, 1917, the Silent Sentinels, as they were called, began daily protests outside the White House, carrying signs that read, "Mr. President, how long must we wait for liberty?" Many of the picketers were arrested throughout the summer and fall for supposedly blocking the sidewalks and were sent to the Occoquan Workhouse Prison in Lorton, Virginia. Lucy Burns, pictured here, was one of the first arrested and sent to Lorton. There, on November 14th, 1917, Lucy Byrne, Alice Paul, and many others were jailed and tortured with brutal force-feeding tubes during what's now called the Night of Terror. You heard about this event just a moment ago from Mrs. Robert Walker. These are photos from the Lucy Burns Museum, located inside the Workhouse Arts Center today. After continued protesting and some leaked information about terrible prison conditions and treatment, President Wilson freed the women and supported the 19th Amendment. Women like Lucy Branham, pictured right, continued advocating for their rights, even wearing their prison uniforms to do so. The road to ratification was rocky and uncertain. States slowly passed their own suffrage state laws, slowly added suffrage sympathizers to Congress, and finally, the 19th Amendment passed the House in May and then the Senate in June of 1919. 36 states needed to ratify the amendment in order for it to become law. After a year, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify on August 18, 1920, and the amendment, nicknamed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, became law on August 26th. As you can see, Virginia waited until 1952, and Mississippi waited until 1984 to ratify it officially. This wasn't the end of the fight, but for now, I'll switch gears a little bit to share what it was like being Virginia's governing family during ratification. Westmoreland and Marguerite Davis moved to Morven Park in 1903. While they started getting involved in community farming issues, the suffrage movement was taking hold. Westmoreland Davis would use his farmer advocate efforts to propel him into Virginia politics during this time, where he would run a progressive campaign in 1917, winning the Democratic primary and then the governorship. There were many things included in his platform, but women's suffrage was not one of them. He was considered a status quo kind of politician who didn't understand why women wanted the vote so badly. It would be hard to ignore the moving and shaking around suffrage, though, once he and Marguerite got to Richmond in 1918. Marguerite Davis acknowledged her delicate situation as an intelligent woman who desired the vote, but as First Lady in a Southern state, who was also married to a governor with political aspirations, she could only offer cautious approval for women's suffrage in 1919. Marguerite balanced relations with the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia, established in 1909, and the National Association opposed to women's suffrage. She was friends with leaders in the anti-movement, yet she entertained suffragists, such as Mrs. Lila Valentine, at the governor's mansion in September of 1920. Just a few months later, the League of Women Voters would form and remain a strong civic organization in Virginia. Here we are, 1919, World War I is over, and Governor Davis would have been watching the U.S. Congress's handling of the 19th Amendment, which passed and required state ratification. So now the ball's in his court. Virginia lawmakers, like many others in states in the South, feared that passing the 19th Amendment would also enfranchise Black women, who threatened the South's Jim Crow-era policies, ensuring white supremacy and political dominance. According to a biography on Davis, the antis against the amendment in the Virginia House passed a resolution instead claiming that the 19th Amendment was, quote, unwarranted, unnecessary, undemocratic, and a dangerous interference with the rights reserved to the states. They preferred to pass a state women's suffrage bill in 1920, which included a poll tax and affirmed the case that both men and women could be subject to the same voting qualifications. The 19th Amendment became the law of the land, and the Davises supported it. Mrs. Davis made sure that she voted in 1920. Now, the governor was already thinking about a future in the U.S. Senate, so in part to appeal to female voters, Davis appointed 31 women to state offices, some as significant as the Second Council of Defense, the State Board of Charities and Corrections, and the Board of Health. He didn't win that Senate seat, but forever changed the leadership within the Commonwealth. 1920, Percival's Carrie Emmerich was the first Loudoun woman to pay her poll tax and qualify to vote. A year later, she and others, quote, bearing scrub buckets and brushes and cakes of soap, invaded the U.S. Capitol and cleansed the statue of three pioneer suffragists, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And so we know from history that some women gained the right to vote in 1920, but others remained disenfranchised until the civil rights movement removed barriers. Women have used their vote and their voice to create positive change for themselves and their communities, and we can remember their struggle and appreciate their achievement today, 100 years later. I wish to thank you for your attention, and now I'm going to pass the screen sharing over to Laura from Balch Library in Leesburg.
Hello. Thank you for that great introduction, Jackie. I'm here at the library, and I'm going to fill in some of the local story that matches up with the history that Jackie just really ably provided. When we started looking at this upcoming anniversary, we wondered what was the local reaction to the suffrage movement, to the passage of the 19th Amendment. And unfortunately, we don't have a huge body of records here at the library that tell us a full story. And there's yet to be a local history written just about the history of the suffrage movement in Loudoun. Somebody should get on that. But we can turn to some records that are here to give us an idea of what people in Loudoun were thinking and feeling as these events took place. Although we know from the history just given that the suffrage movement began much earlier, the earliest notes we find in local papers such as the Loudoun Mirror show up in 1914. That's when Mrs. Valentine, Lilla Meade Valentine, pictured here, came to Loudoun County as the head of the Equal Suffrage League to speak in Leesburg. And around this time of year, it was first announced in August, and then in September she arrived. Her talk drew a large crowd, which is great. And one thing that was noted in the newspaper coverage you can see here, and I do apologize for the quality, it's from microfilm, and microfilm brings some challenges in reading it, but if you can read for yourself, the anticipation was great. I love the phrasing, the warm embers of desire to vote have been fanned into a roaring blaze of a demand for the ballot. Mrs. Valentine was a very able speaker, and her speech that evening helped some people in Leesburg particularly overcome some of the stereotypes about the suffragists. One thing that's notable is the Leesburg mayor at the time, Charles Harrison, pictured here, actually introduced the speech. And his wife was very active in the equal rights movement that would grow up in Loudoun, which we can see here. So equal suffragists hold their first meeting in October of 1914. We can read a little bit about the early members of this association. And as we learned from our wonderful introduction, many of them came from more affluent families in Loudoun County. We see the names of people like Mrs. Walter Harrison, Mrs. Louis Powell, people who had the means to go out and devote the time to the suffrage movement. Their reports appear in the wonderful Virginia Suffrage News, which the Library of Virginia has digitized and put online, so we can see some of their efforts and read a little bit about what they were encountering as they went out and started to advocate for the suffrage movement. Here in November 1914, we get a good picture of what they were up against. Mrs. Joel Chandler Harris, who lived at Selma, was president then, and she was the correspondent, and she wrote to the State League, "Loudoun County is one of the most conservative counties in the state. It is an entirely agricultural county, and the people, being widely separated, are slow to grasp the forward movement of the outside world and reluctant to change old habits for new." It's hard today to think in some ways of Loudoun County as being largely that agricultural and backward thinking, but they felt that these were the challenges they had to work against. Moving forward in time, they continued to work for many years. So in 1916, we can see here again that there is another speech going on. Unfortunately, in between these various articles, we don't find a lot in the paper that discusses events that were held in Loudoun or the meetings of the equal suffrage groups. We do find people who pop up again and again. One was Miss Dora Pike, who often hosted people or turns up in events in Loudoun where she is enabling this movement. In this case, they met in both Leesburg and Purcellville, and we do see satellite meetings where a speaker will come and they will go from town to town, from Leesburg to Purcellville to Middleburg. One thing that I highly recommend if you're interested in learning more about suffrage is the recent publication from the Library of Virginia, The Campaign for Women's Suffrage in Virginia. A really very cool artifact that I'm very jealous of that they feature in this book is this index card. So the Equal Suffrage League created index cards for members so that they could keep track of when they talked to people in the House of Delegates in the Senate and what they needed to do to convince them. So here is actually Loudoun and Fauquier County's local delegate, Wilbur Hall, who we do have some papers for here at the library, none of which mentioned the suffrage movement. And you can see sort of how they strategized and engaged with him to try to push him to their side and their viewpoint. It's a really great book, and I highly recommend it. So not everything was all support and enabling and helping with the suffrage movement. Another artifact that we have here that sort of shows the other side is James E. Copeland's scrapbooks. Copeland was a local doctor. His scrapbooks include also documentation of things like the influenza epidemic in 1918. He had an interesting habit, which you'll see in some of these clippings, of clipping out articles about events going on at the time, and he would wonderfully include the date and newspaper, which not everybody does in their scrapbooks. But he'd also occasionally put in a little anecdotal annotation that shows what he felt. We have here some negative articles about suffrage that are sort of par for the course of what you see popping up in national and local papers. One is in individual women who espouse views against suffrage, such as this woman who's 104 104 and is a foe of equal suffrage. But you also have positive coverage that show the progress. This is the article that ran in the Loudoun Times in August 19th, 1920, that sort of announced the events in Tennessee that Jackie mentioned in her talk. This would be the first notice locally that the suffrage amendment had passed. The 19th Amendment had passed. We also will see later an official proclamation is published here. Mr. Copeland has added in some commentary about what he thinks will happen with voting and politics and what the implications of this will be. We also have notations such as Mrs. O.L. Emmerich paying her poll tax and being the first person. I think it's very notable that she is congratulated in the newspaper. Mr. Copeland decided to put this on a page next to an article focusing on the tax implications of women being able to vote. One thing to keep in mind, as Jackie mentioned, poll taxes were established that women had to pay before they could be registered to vote. So with Mrs. Emmerich paying her poll tax, we realized there's this gateway still that's limiting the number of women who can register to vote. It didn't hold back that many people, and through the fall of 1920, we see a lot of women who go ahead and pay the poll tax and register. By September 9th, we see that 33 women have paid their poll tax. And they gave a few names. Mrs. H.D. Buechler, for instance, had been involved with equal suffrage movements back in 1914. They held a meeting at her house. Her husband owned a bakery on King Street here in Leesburg. This is a little bit hard to read, but this is information that actually told women how to register. And you see several articles that go into the process. You have to pay your state capitation tax, your poll tax, then you can go and register with the registrar. One thing that I find kind of interesting about this article from September 16th is that it shows the growth in the number of women who have registered. So we have 132 women, one who was an African-American woman. And it also gives them information about how to record their name. A very frustrating thing if you've done any genealogical or historical research in the 20th century is the fact that often you can have a female ancestor or subject that you're researching and you'll never know their actual given name because they're always referred to as their husband, Mrs. John C. Doe. So it's very wonderful in many ways that here they're telling people to register by their given name. So Mrs. Mary Jane Doe, this is extremely helpful. The reason I say that is we actually have voter registration records here at the Thomas Balch Library in our archives. And in many cases, we can see a woman's given name if we can identify her. So I've selected a page here from the Percival Precinct in Loudoun that shows some of the first women to register in 1920. And it's a little hard to read, I know. It's a very large book, but it does give you a quick bird's eye view of the people who registered. I love this page because you get a variation of the age. There are some men here on the page, but here we see Mary E. Purcell, who's 76. I also like that she's a retired housekeeper. We can get the idea of the range when we see Louise Paxton, who was only 22 and registered. This page is a bit of a mess, and I've had to piece it together so you could get the whole span, but it also does show, if you look very far down at the bottom, about the 1, 2, 3, 4, 6th record up from the bottom, we have a record that's been scratched out. And this is for, it looks like Lena M Cook, who is a housekeeper. She's been scratched out because she was a person of color, and they recorded her in the wrong register. But we also can see she registered on October 1st, 1920, which I'm guessing from this page where we have addended records at the very top was a very hectic time as many new voters were added to the rolls in advance of the election. This is a record that's a bit easier to see. We also have Loudoun County voter registration record voter registration records, and oaths here at the library. And they cover a very large range of time from 1967 to 1964. This is a record from the Jefferson District. Irene is a long gone town, unfortunately, that was sort of between Hamilton and Purcellville. And we can see women who were added to the rolls here, including Serena R. Collins, who was an African-American woman. I think these records are really great to just get the names and see how people felt the need to go out and register and get voting. One thing that's missing from both the newspaper coverage and the voter registration records, unfortunately, is the voice of women voters themselves. And here we have one little peek at what many women were thinking, possibly. The Home Interest Club is an organization of women in Loudoun County that formed in the late 19th century. They were generally housewives, I guess is the term. But they were women who were interested in talking about the topics of the day. So for roll call, when you showed up to the Home Interest Club meeting, your name would be called and you would be expected to provide an interesting viewpoint or piece of news or political information. You had to give your opinion about something. So these are their minutes from October 30th, 1920. And the group decided that for that meeting, they would prepare themselves as voters and become better educated about what would be on the ballot. So they write, the program began with an illuminating talk by Mrs. George Hoke, giving us advanced information on ballots and how to use them. As can be imagined, we listened with breathless interest, also many misgivings from lifelong habit. We would rather do the easy things and leave the hard ones for the men. We would not admit it for the world, but this business of voting looks tremendous. So this that was written before they actually voted, and some wonderful person has then added back in. Note, the foregoing was written before the election day. At this date, the 3rd of November, voting seems the simplest and easiest matter imaginable, and we can only wonder that we have not been voting since the beginning of things. So you can kind of see the before and after, where they had some anxiety in anticipation of how difficult voting might be, and then after it was done, they're like, why weren't we doing this whole time? So our correspondence here is Miss Carolyn Hancoast, and Miss Elizabeth B. Wilson. And I know Miss Pancoast is one of the women featured in this much earlier photo from 1906 of the women's, the home, the club, the Home Interest Club, sorry. So we don't have a lot after that. There are articles in the newspaper that record women becoming Democratic delegates and members of the Democratic Party and members of the Republican Party. One thing that I like that we have is actually a cookbook from the Virginia League of Women Voters that dates to 1921. So this was a fundraiser, and it's filled with ads. And it was a way for women to invest in organizations that supported women's suffrage. So they were encouraged in the introduction to this cookbook to go out and support the companies like Sowers who supported the League of Women Voters. So I am going to now pass the sharing over to Joanne, I believe. To carry on the story.
Hello. I'm not sure if I got the screen share yet. Okay. Hi, my name is Joanne. I am with, I'm not entirely sure if I'm sharing the screen. Hold on. Am can you see the PowerPoint slides?
We cannot, Joanne. Do you have the upload button?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Should take a minute.
Oh, Okay, so I'm not sharing screen. I think that's what I was waiting for.
That's it. There you go.
Okay.
Here you go.
Okay. This is after the vote. I am going to show you the epilogue. Thank you, Laura. The National Women's Party is still in existence today. It was started by Alice Paul and Lucy Byrne, and their focus came after the ratification. Their focus became equality for women, because they felt that women would still be discriminated against. The Seneca Falls, they had sentiments, and some of those sentiments included equal pay, which we talk about today, and other things like equal opportunity in employment. Again, this is something that is talked about today. So after a few drafts, Alice Paul did write the Equal Rights Amendment, and it says, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. Recently, Virginia ratified the ERA. Yay! We became the 38th state to do so, which means that three-fourths of the states have ratified it, and it can now go on to Washington, where 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate need to pass it in order for it to go on to the U.S. Constitution, which is pretty exciting. I don't recall when the last amendment went on. It is expected to have a fight. So the National American Women's Suffrage Association, under Carrie Chapman Catt, became the League of Women Voters on February 14th, 1920. The League's focus became registering women voters and to inform the voter on how to vote. One of the criticisms that women had was that they didn't know how to vote. They were not smart enough to vote. And before you say this is a crazy argument, back in February, I've heard the argument used in my lifetime. Back in February, during the presidential primaries, an official in Iowa was asked, why should Iowa be the first presidential primary, which is asked every 4 years? And she said that, well, Iowans know how to vote. They take their vote seriously. And they do their research, because, you know, the rest of us just vote willy-nilly and go with what we feel like at the time. So moving on. So the League of Women Voters also deals with issues, and they research their issues. Some of these issues, like we just had the Virginia League of Women Voters just had affordable housing study. The study takes 2 years, and then we vote on what position that we want to take on affordable housing in this case. A lot of these we still find very important to us. Remember that League of Women Voters is nonpartisan. We do not back a party, nor do we back a politician or a candidate. So in 1920, the Richmond League of Women Voters, because they were the largest league, registered 13,000 women. Keep in mind, they had only 2 months to do so because it was ratified in August, and 2,500 of which were Black women. And as stated before, although the women did vote in 1920 because of the 19th Amendment, the Virginia General Assembly did not pass it until 1952. These are some articles that I found while researching this, and I enjoyed this. Governor Davis went home, and Mrs. Davis left for their home in Loudoun County yesterday, where they will today cast their ballot. So both Governor Davis and Mrs. Davis did vote. In 1924, we had two women to the Virginia Assembly, General Assembly. That's Mrs. Fain and Mrs. Henderson. And just this year, we had our first female Madam Speaker of the Virginia House. So that's exciting too. A note about Prohibition. So Prohibition happened because the women suffragists joined with the temperance movement. And so I read in a Smithsonian article kind of recently that said before Prohibition, people drank to, or men drank to excess and were drunk regularly. And as Lynn so nicely put it, I say nicely, but you know what I mean. Lynn had said that this leads to domestic violence. And so women had a reason to get this vote so they can take care of themselves because they had no power to do so otherwise. After Prohibition, this article also said that things changed about alcohol. People started to just do it for social reasons rather than just drinking for drinking's sake, probably addiction. And I also want to point out, this also took the money out of the pockets, go to the barkeep, and this helped that as well. So for those of when I was growing up, people used to say, oh, Prohibition was a mistake. It wasn't, it worked. That's my point on that. So as I end here, the registration to vote, please register to vote. We are so lucky in Virginia that we can register online. No, not all states have that. I was just in a meeting with the National Voter Registration Day Committee, and they were telling me that we are losing 2 million new registers to vote, voter registrations a month during this pandemic. So if you haven't done so, or if you haven't in a while, you can check your voter registration, check your address that you have the right polling place, go to vote.elections.virginia.gov, and I inspire you to be an informed voter, and you can check that out on vote411.org. As I said, the league is very issues-based, and I know and I think many people do, when you choose your elected officials or even amendments that come up on the ballot or even budget items, you want to do your research and you want to see who aligns with your belief system. And so you are an informed voter. And I highly recommend that you do this. And if the answers to the questions that are at 411 are directly from the politicians. We do not fill it in, they do. If your issue is not in there, I highly encourage you to call them, email them. They're very eager to talk to you during this election period. And with that, I hand it off to, I believe, Tracy.
Okay. I believe I'm back on. Thank you. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you to Laura and Jackie, and thank you to Mimi Walker. Mimi Walker is known to us today in 2020 as Lynn Garvey Hodge. Lynn is a member of the Fairfax County History Commission and a national board member of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial. That's a great segue for me to say a few words about the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial. As Turning Point honorary board member Eleanor Clift has said, the 19th Amendment engineered the greatest expansion of democracy on a single day the world had ever seen, and yet women's suffrage faded from public memory almost as soon as it happened. This new memorial will remind everyone of the historical importance of the women's suffrage movement overall and of the passage of the amendment in 1920. Occoquan Regional Park, a part of Nova Parks, will be the home of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial. It will commemorate the 5 million women from every state, creed, race, and nationality who fought for over 7 decades to win women's right to vote. The location at Occoquan Regional Park is part of the historic DC prison grounds where many of the suffragists were imprisoned for picketing at the White House in 1917, as you heard from Mimi. I'm sorry we don't have an image of what the memorial is going to look like. I hope that we would have one, but it looks like it's not on our screen. The suffragists' inhumane treatment there in the DC prison grounds, as we know, became a turning point when President Woodrow Wilson finally asked Congress to consider a constitutional amendment. The Turning Point Suffragist Memorial Association and Nova Parks recently learned some exciting news. A 24-foot section of the White House fence that these women protested in front of will be on long-term loan for inclusion in the memorial. So exciting and so meaningful. The mission of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial Association is to educate, inspire, and empower present and future generations to remain vigilant in the quest for liberty, freedom, and equality. How timely that mission is today. You can help me and all the rest of us raise the remaining funds that are needed to make this national memorial a reality. Join me by donating any amount that you can by going to www.suffragistmemorial.org. Click on the donate button in the upper right corner. I'm going to do that as soon as we're done here. I'm going to do that in honor of Mimi Walker and also in honor of Lynn Garvey Hodge, both ladies keeping this effort alive. Please consider making a donation to honor those who made women's votes count. I'm now going to turn the microphone back over to our host, Lorraine Moffa, Loudoun County Public Libraries. Lorraine, thank you for hosting us today. And let's see now if we have any questions, I hope.
So thank you everybody for joining us today. And please, if you have any questions, just type them in the chat box, or if you'd like to ask the question yourself, raise your hand, and you can do that by clicking on the little hand button that's above the chat line. So Joanne, there was a question for you. There's an image of the Turning Point Memorial. The question is, did you say that we were losing 2 million voters a month because of COVID?
Yes.
Voting registrations?
There's a voter registration day, which is September 22nd, and I sat in on it because we're a league and we register voters. And I think it is national. So that's 2 million new registers a month. And I was like, how is that possible? Now it's only been a few months, and I thought about it, and we have like 40,000 students in Loudoun County alone graduating. So I guess that's right. It was a quote from the National Voter Registration Day Committee. So yeah, that's what they said. I was shocked.
Wow.
Now, Virginia, as I understand it, just made it so when you go to get your license, you automatically are on the voter rolls unless you say otherwise. So that's positive. That just started though, last month, I believe. So that's positive. But we still have people who move and things like that.
Okay. So a lot of comments saying that they really liked the presentation, but any other questions or comments? So how are the American suffragists inspired or influenced by Britain's suffragettes?
I liked how Lynn said Alice Paul learned from Emmeline, I forget her last name, Emmeline something. They worked with them, but I always wondered why they didn't do that here in the United States. But it was interesting to hear Lynn say it had to do, they made that choice that they wanted to be more ladylike. But I know they did learn a lot. Parkhurst, I remember Emmeline Parkhurst was the woman in England. They were more militant. They would break windows. There is a great movie called Suffragette, I believe, and that's British based. And then there's Iron Jaw Angels, which is Suffragists, which was us. And I want to point this out because sometimes I check eBay for suffragist stuff because I'm a weirdo. We're gold, white, and purple. They're green, white, and purple. And I say that because every once in a while I go, oh, that's beautiful. I didn't know we had that. And I realize, oh, no, that's green. That's not us. Not that that matters.
Let me also add to that. The reason the British girls were green, white, and violet, because it stood for Give Women the Vote. So the colors that we used were very similar to the British girls, but Give Women the Vote stood for that green, white, and violet.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Any other questions? Okay, it looks like not. Ladies, thank you so much. That was a terrific program. We appreciate it. I'm going to type my email in here. If anybody would like to contact any of the speakers afterwards, you can just send me a note and I would be glad to pass it on to them. And before we leave, please, everybody, exercise your right to vote.
Amen. Vote.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Lorraine.
You're welcome. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye, ladies.
Yeah. Ladies,
work
hold
together.
on just a moment. If you would all just wait just a minute, okay?
Tracy.
Okay, so it's just us. Right? Tracy left, though.
Oh, I was curious how many people.
31.
I flew through my speech, I gotta say. I timed it and I thought I would, okay, 7-8 minutes. I got it down because I told you 8 minutes. And then I was like, what the hell? Slow down.
We lost like 2 attendees at one point, but then they came back. So it was 31. So that's pretty good for an afternoon.
Wow, they stuck with it the whole time. I'm impressed.
Yeah, it was pretty good.
That's wonderful.
Lorraine, were you streaming this as well, or just